All right, as promised, now I want to bring in one of my favorite people to talk to, just because, well, he's one of the smartest people that I talk to. And you know what they say: if you hire people who are smarter than you are, you prove to be smarter than they are. Well, when you book guests who are smarter than you are, they make you a hell of a lot smarter. That I can tell you. John Arlott is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Serves as senior advisor for research and statistics in the Office of Justice Programs and the Office of Legal Policy in the U.S. Department of Justice during 2020 and 2021. He's testified countless times before Congress. And like I said, he's one of our go-to guys when it comes to all things, particularly with respect to the Second Amendment. But he is just a researcher extraordinaire. And let's welcome now John Arlott Jr. back to Strictly Speaking. Whoops, that's the wrong one. This is the right one. John Arlott, welcome back, my friend. How are you, sir?
Doing great, Bob. It's great to talk to you again. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I quickly flashed up your article there, so I'm also going to flash it back up now because what we're going to talk about. John, you're talking about the transgender violence, and you know nobody wants to talk about transgender violence. Why are you talking about transgender violence? I was paying really close attention, John, to the Supreme Court hearings over a week ago, in which it was very apparent that California is in trouble. California is in trouble for hiding from parents their children's proclivities toward transgenderism, or their, quite frankly, they're following where they're being led in the schools, right. Which is what the bottom line here is. And parents don't have a right to know if their kids are changing their names while in school, changing their pronouns, changing clothes, looking like the opposite sex, but shh, parents don't get to know that. Well, the Supreme Court pretty much said, yes, they do. So, right. Which is a huge, huge momentum shift in this attempt to, reverse course from this weird trans craze that we have found ourselves in for the last several years, maybe the last decade or so, that it's really gone extreme. So, John, this is a very timely article when you talk about the number of these confused kids / adults in the transgender world who end up being very, very violent.
Right. Yeah, no, the Supreme Court came out with an initial decision this last week where they were saying California passed a law saying that school districts weren't supposed to go and inform parents, despite whatever the school district policy was, about whether their child was transitioning or not. They by a 6-3 decision with the 3 Democrat liberals saying California's law was okay. The 6 Republican nominees or appointees were saying, no, you have parental rights on these things to know what's happening to your child on these things. They, at least initially, struck down California's law that's there. Now, it has to go back to lower courts, and it'll eventually maybe come back up to the Supreme Court, but at least that's very encouraging. And obviously just dealing with the trans issue has been kind of a third rail. A lot of people have been afraid. In fact, I was just on a conference call earlier today where, it's hard to find academics or researchers who are willing to go and work on the issue, even though they privately know that it's, a real mess, just because they don't want to deal with the backlash that could follow from that.
Yeah, there's no question about it. But you know what? There needs to be backlash against the, those who would deny some of the statistics, some of the research that you've done here, or those who would even worse than deny, would manipulate statistics to try to sell the lie that transgender individuals, who by their very nature are mentally, what's the word? I don't want to say mentally ill, but I guess psychologically impaired is a way to say this, because either they are actually gender dysphoric, which is a term and a condition that has been diagnosed, or they have been indoctrinated, temporarily brainwashed, if you will, with the idea that they're not what they actually are. Point being, when your mind has been in some way compromised, it can manifest itself in a lot of ways, including violence. And that's what this is all about. That's what these statistics that you have put together actually show. So why don't you take us through this?
Right. I mean, there's been a lot of media analysis on whether or not transgender individuals are more violent or not than other people in the population. You have every place from the New York Times, the Associated Press, fact checkers like PolitiFact and Snopes, who have done God knows how many different analyses of these things. And if you go and you try to use one of these AI chatbots like ChatGPT or Grok or whatever, they'll just regurgitate the stuff that's there from those different media outlets. And it's really, I don't know how else to phrase it other than just statistical malpractice. So, one of the simplest points is just when you look at whether a group is engaged disproportionately in a certain action, you have to account for that group's share of the population. So if you find, let's say, 10% of active shooters in the United States are transgender, you want to go and see, well, what percentage of the population are transgenders? If it's 7.3% of, less than 1% or 1%, 10% is a lot compared to their share of the population. And I think if you look at it conservatively in 2024, the active shooting attacks that occurred there, first of all, active shooting attacks are attacks that occur in public using the FBI definition, not part of some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery, anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. And what you find is that transgender individuals are at least overrepresented by a factor of 12 compared to their share of the population. If you look at mass public shootings, which is kind of a subset of active shootings, it's guns fired in public, not part of some other type of crime, but more narrower than active shootings because you're just looking at mass basically means 4 or more people murdered. What you find is that over the time period from 2018 through 2025, they're overrepresented by about 6-fold, a little bit over 6-fold compared to their share of the population. So, those are statistically significant numbers that are there. On our website, we kind of go through the statistical stuff that's there. And, it's at least something that people want to look at. One of the problems, and you and I have talked about this before, is that the media, when you're talking about active shootings or mass public shootings, I think has done a very poor job of talking about those. You and I have talked about how these mass murders explicitly explain that they go after gun-free zones. They may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to get media coverage. And they know the more people they kill, the more media coverage that they're going to be able to go and get. And they know if they go to a place where their victims aren't going to be able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be able to go and kill more people. And you see the same arguments with regard to the trans, whether it be the Nashville school shooter who was trans, or the Minneapolis school shooter last fall who's also trans. They explicitly explain that they picked gun-free zones, but the media absolutely refuses to go and mention why these individuals pick the targets that they do. And you and I have talked about, can we figure out any benign explanation for why that's not newsworthy? I can't. But if you look at a lot of these trans killers, the media, you just had this attack in Rhode Island, and the media in that case refused. The New York Times, the Associated Press, CNN, ABC, NBC, all refused to even mention that the murderer there was trans.
I don't recall, John, this is, you want to hear something really sad?
Yeah, sure.
I don't recall the Rhode Island story. This is how bad it's gotten. There are so many of these events. Sometimes they're almost just kind of glancing by the news, the news notifications. It's not grabbing you the way it used to. Oh my gosh, a terrible mass shooting, because there are too many of them, and there are too many disturbed people out there committing them. So I don't recall the Rhode Island shooting. Can you recount that for us?
Well, it occurred almost the exact same time that we had this mass public shooting in Canada, which was also by a trans individual.
Yeah.
The media was a little bit better on covering that, but even the Associated Press refused to identify the attacker there as trans. Obviously, the Associated Press is carried around the world on these stories, so it has an impact on these things. But just last month in February, we had the Canada attack, and we had this attack in Rhode Island at an ice skating rink. There was, I guess, a hockey game that was going on there. And the father had gone and killed both his ex-wife and his son, who was there, and shot some other people. A third person died also, or was murdered also. So, anyway, that's just an example.
Yeah, that was the case. I had forgotten Rhode Island. I guess that's why I didn't, but I remember the hockey shooting. So John, it's one thing to call out the media, as you are correctly doing, for, what you're calling, statistical malpractice. But let's also talk about how they and how whomever the other organizations that are studying these things, like you are, how they refer to mass shootings. What makes up a mass shooting? Because you correctly point out in your article, which everybody should read on, it's available on the Federalist and it's on your webpage and so forth at crimeresearch.org. Let's talk a little bit more about gang shootings. Let's talk a little bit more about some of these things that are not what we traditionally or typically have come to know as intentional mass slaughter events.
Right. So there are two main areas of problems with regard to the analysis that people are doing. One, as I mentioned, is they don't account for trans share of the population. That's very basic. The other thing they do is that they're including a lot of cases that really don't belong in comparisons there. Look, gang fights over drug turf are bad. People need to go and look at those. But it's pretty clear that everybody from the media to the FBI and others differentiate a gang fight over drug turf as being very different than a mass public shooting where somebody is going around with the sole aim of just trying to kill as many innocent people as possible and to get media attention. That's not what's motivating mass public shooters that are there. I mean gang fights. So, and what you find is they'll go and use data from the Gun Violence Archive, which is a gun control group, which defines mass shooting as 3 or more people injured. And about 85% of their cases are instances involving gang fights over drug turf. Most of the rest are robberies where multiple people are shot. And the thing is, these transgender ones, anybody who reads the diaries and manifestos for these people know that they're not like gang, fights over drug turf. They're very similar to the traditional mass public shootings where they are suicidal. They want to get media attention. As I mentioned before, if you read their diaries and manifestos, they explicitly talk about things like gun-free zones. The Minneapolis school shooter last fall not only explains that he picked the school because it was a gun-free zone. Minneapolis has a 5-year prison term for people who carry a gun onto school property. Not all states have that by any means. But on top of that, he not only picked the target, but the time of day. He didn't want to do it in the morning or in the afternoon when parents were dropping off or picking up their kids at school, because he was worried that one of the parents might have a permanent concealed handgun and might use it to go and stop him. And so he wanted to, you'll have the media going and saying things like, well, he was talking about other mass school shooters or other mass murderers. And that's true, he was. But the reason why he was talking about them was that this transgender murderer was learning from these other individuals how he could go and create the most carnage, how he could go and kill the most people because he wanted to get media attention. And so, I look at these transgender individuals. There's a lot of evidence that indicates that they go and commit suicide at very high rates. And so it's not too shocking to me that given how, when you look through these mass public shooters, they're overwhelmingly suicidal individuals. It's not shocking to me that these transgender ones are disproportionately represented in both mass public shootings and active shooting attacks.
Yeah, 12 times you were talking about before. In fact, that was the first statistic you gave. 12 times more likely given than their percentage of the population to commit a mass shooting like this. And again,
active shooting case in 2024
cases. Yeah. That's an astounding number. Like you said, I mean, if somebody said to me that trans shooters or trans individuals are twice as likely as the general population to commit a terrible act like this, I would say, oh my gosh, if you told me 3 times. But when you say 12-fold, I mean, people need to really understand that. It's not 12% more. It's 12 times. It's 12 times 100. You know what I mean? So it's astronomical that if you have a trans individual, it is far, far more likely that that individual is going to commit a crime, a terrible active shooter crime like this than a person in the general part of the population. And why wouldn't the media want the people of this country to know that? A curious media used to report on those kinds of things because it's extraordinarily relevant to the well-being of the society that the fourth estate is supposed to serve.
Right. Well, you would think the media would point out things like these guys explicitly targeting gun-free zones and things like that. You know, if we're going to stop these attacks, if we're going to deal with them, then we need to understand these things. And my guess is that the entire debate about mass public shooting would be very different if some of these, targeting of gun-free zones, if the media would report on that once in a while, but they won't.
Yeah, well, and I guess we kind of have to ask ourselves, can we rely on the media, today's media, the way we used to? And I'm not saying it was ever perfect. It wasn't. And I'm not saying it was never political or agenda-driven, because I think it has been for a very, very long time. But not to this level, to the point where they would ignore obvious basic statistics that can be gathered from FBI data like you do, and crunch all of these things together, whether it be about gun-free zones or whether it be about the psychological profile of the shooters in terms of trans versus not and so forth. I feel like the media is being very intentional and deliberate in not saying these things. It's not that they can't find them out. They have an agenda that is maybe a little bit more aggressive than they have had in the past.
Well, look, I mean, I've dealt with the media for decades now, and it's interesting to me to see how it's changed. So 20 years ago, places like the New York Times and Washington Post would at least go through kind of the motions to go and talk to people on both sides of the issue. You go and read news stories in the New York Times or Washington Post, excuse me, the vast majority of news stories only have people on one side of the issue that they interview. I've talked to people who are in what do you call it, media schools. They are taught now not to go and deal with people on both sides of the issues. Now, could you always bias things, even though you would go and interview people on both sides of the issues? Sure. If you go talk to somebody for a half hour and they make 5 strong arguments and 1 really weak argument, and you want them to look bad, you pick the weak argument as the one you have the quote from. So, there's lots of ways that they could still manipulate, but at least they felt some desire to at least appear balanced. I don't think they care about that anymore, unfortunately.
No, and it's to our detriment as a society. I mean, honestly, because and maybe in fact, there's no maybe about it. I think the media that you have been at war with for a long time, and that might not be fair to say, they've been at war with you. You have not picked fights with them, other than to point out things like you do in this article that they're not doing anymore. But they've had it in for you for a very, very long time. And this media, like I said, is agenda-driven like none other. And I think it's very, very clear and obvious why. Tell me, how you're treated by the media, John.
Well, part of the change is, 15 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I would be on CNN or NBC, which is now MS Now. I would get interviewed by the New York Times or the Washington Post or places like that. Now you just don't get interviewed at all by
What
those
changed?
places.
What changed though? Why were
I
you?
think it's basically that they don't feel the need to go and have people on both sides. I mean, maybe it's been 7 or 8 years since the last time I was on MSNBC. I think Chuck Todd had me on. But it's been well over a decade since I was on CNN, I think the last time. I didn't mind, I'd be on with Piers Morgan and it'd be like 3-1 or something like that. That's fine. I just, so long as I was able to get something out there, some facts that people wouldn't have heard of otherwise. But they don't do that anymore. They have a certain agenda that they want to get, and they make sure that they have the person who's going to go and say what they want them to say.
What's interesting, John, to me, if I may, you said that the reason they stopped having you on is because they stopped having a commitment to putting people on from both sides. I know they would disagree with this, but I've never really seen you as a guy with a side. You're on the side of what the statistics show, what the research shows. Your website is crimeresearch.org. It's why your organization is the Crime Prevention Research Center. You're interested in preventing crime. That means studying crime and taking it wherever the data takes you. If the data took you to a place where maybe your particular political ideology wouldn't look bad, would you suppress it or would you put it out there?
Look, my views have changed a lot on a lot of different issues over time. I'm sure it'd be easy for people to document the changes that have occurred. But it's the point is it doesn't fit in with the narrative that the media wants to go and push. They have a certain, or at least part of the media wants to go and push. I'll get calls or whatever from somebody like a Greg Gutfeld every once in a while when he wants to find out something. But I'm not, Jake Tapper is not going to talk to me anymore. I mean, I used to have his cell number, but he blocked me. I used to be able to text back and forth. I mean, we had at least some type of conversation back and forth. There was one time, maybe a decade ago, Chuck Todd and I were able to text back and forth. I would go and point out what I think is an inaccuracy in their stories, and they would block me afterwards. So, but it's just, I worry that there's a large group of people in the United States who are just not exposed to a variety of arguments. And I think that has a big effect on the political debate that we have.
I do too, John, and I think it's critical, not just what they're doing to you, because I'm a fan of your work, but just what they're doing to the people, because they're denying giving the people the full story. And like you said, I still don't think it's quite both sidesism, because I don't think you're on the side. Like I said, I think if you were to try to do a full what do you call a battery of research? It's probably not the right terminology, but if you were to conduct a full analytical research study on trans shooters, and you found that they are indeed exactly what the media portrays them, a very minuscule, not even counting their percentage of the population, which you did in this study. If you'd have found that, there are not very many of them, even for their small amount of the population, you would have said so, right? You wouldn't have said so. You would have, because you're about the stats and you're about making people aware of what's going on crime-wise in reality, not just with an agenda-driven slant to your research.
Well, thanks for saying that. I appreciate it. I mean, I like to think so. I mean, it's just, people in the media or Wikipedia or whatever will go and classify me as a Second Amendment advocate. I don't view myself that way. I just view myself as somebody who goes and looks at the data. In fact, I don't make Second Amendment type arguments. I don't make those types of arguments. To me, the bottom line is what makes people safer, what saves lives. And, the only way we know about that and figuring it out is by looking at the data on these things.
Right. And you know what? I don't want to get off into this, but you would be, in my opinion, it would be fine if you were a Second Amendment advocate doing this. That doesn't mean you're not a principled researcher, because being
Right, well,
being a Second
but then they like to label me like that just because then I don't come across. I can go and say he's not a researcher. All I can tell you is that's not what got me involved in this. It's not the reason why I stay involved in the debate. The reason why I got involved, the reason why I stay involved is I want to figure out what saves lives. And so, anyway.
No, and I respect the hell out of that. I do. It's just, if I call myself a First Amendment advocate, and I did a bunch of research to see, which type of people, for whatever the demographic I'm looking at, and maybe it's an age demographic or race demographic or profession demographic or whatever it is, or political, ideological demographic, to see who gets canceled more, who gets shut down more, and think, it doesn't mean I'm a biased person, because I believe in the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Well, hopefully people will look at the data that you're presenting and not necessarily who's presenting it. The data should be able to stand or fall on its own.
Exactly.
I agree.
That's the point I'm making. So, to me, any person can be a Second Amendment. All that means is I'm a constitutional advocate. I believe in what the Constitution says, and I study things in that regard. And what they turn up, they turn up. And so that's important. So, John, going back to the trans thing, I mentioned it earlier on. The Supreme Court the Supreme Court, not in California, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in a California case, not a final decision, but a California case that said that kids who are in school pretending to be something they're not, either at the direction of teachers or counselors or on their own, or maybe under peer pressure from other kids, which is, I think, a big part of this. They're going to school and they're changing their name. They're going to school and they're changing their pronouns. They're going to school and they're changing their clothes in the coat closets and come out another way, and then going home. And then, we've talked about this before. It's a big step what the Supreme Court decided here. Do you think that, well, first of all, that you already discussed, who the individuals were on this, but what is the next step in the, dare I call it, the public detransitioning of this age or this phase that we are in right now?
I don't know. I mean, they're probably political people that probably have a better, their finger better on the pulse of what's happening. I mean, I know with regard to the court cases, right now there's a court case that the Supreme Court is deciding, hasn't come out with its decision, dealing with transgender athletes in sports, whether states like Tennessee can ban them from being able to do that. The next step would be whether or not, even in the states that allow it, do women have certain protections there? So that may be a more difficult case for women's rights peoples to go and win that one. We'll have to see, but that'll maybe be a year or two down the road. You have, I don't think they're going to get federal legislation through that's going to kind of ban medical procedures on kids. I mean, obviously Trump has done a lot with regard to cutting back funding for those. But, you have this Democratic Senate candidate, Rizzo, I guess, or whatever, who just won the Democratic Senate race primary there. I mean, the guy is constantly bringing up and pushing the trans issue. So if they're going to do it in Texas, if you ask me where the politics are on it, there's at least seems like there's a lot of Democrats, even in what you would regard as relatively conservative states, that must think that this is kind of a winning issue for them. So
it was one of the biggest issues, I believe, in 2024, and it didn't work out so well for them. And that's kind of the reason for my question. I feel like that a corner has been turned here with a few different, and what President Trump said too in the State of the Union address, John, when he said, look, parents cannot have their kids ripped them from their arms by the state because they refuse to quote unquote affirm what a young preformative minded kid wants to be. Right? If they refuse to give them puberty blockers and then hormones and so on and so forth, and to prepare them for surgery, the state can't keep taking these kids away. There is a fundamental, and again, this is a safety issue, John. in my view, it's a crime. It's a criminal issue for the state to take.
I mean, the strange thing is you have a 12 or 13-year-old or 14-year-old who's making a decision that's going to affect the rest of their lives. Are they able to go and make that irreversible decision to essentially sterilize them so they're not going to be able to go and have kids? I mean, it's one thing for an adult to make those types of decisions. It seems like it's another bridge that's a lot farther for some kid. I mean, you go and you tell them, you're never going to have relationships with another adult, intimate relations. You're never going to be able to have kids. Does a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old really appreciate what they're losing by going through and being sterilized like that? I at least I'm skeptical that they would know that.
Well, no, they can't. I mean, there's a reason why every state in the country, it says you cannot enter into a legally binding contract until you're at the very least.
Or get a tattoo or whatever.
Get a tattoo, exactly. You can't even consent to having sex if you're 16.
Right.
In most states. So the idea that they can do this and sterilize themselves and so forth is crazy. But that's one direction. And I wanted to ask you about that Supreme Court case again, John, for the purpose of bringing up another Supreme Court case. You and I talked about this before we started recording. Give me your thoughts on the case that was heard last week, in which the government apparently is really, really trying hard to limit the use of recreational marijuana or in any capacity, and even tying that to gun rights. Give me what you know.
Right. So we have 40 states where it's legal for Americans to be able to go and use marijuana, plus the District of Columbia, plus some territories. And but federal law has classified marijuana as a class 1 type substance. Trump has signed an executive order where he wants to get it removed down to a class 3, which isn't as restrictive. But the thing is, if you're using one of these class drugs that are there, classified drugs, you're banned from being able to go and own a gun. And so the issue is if somebody, and this was brought up very explicitly, if you have somebody who's taking a gummy for sleep every once in a while, are they a regular user of marijuana and therefore banned from being able to go and have guns for self-defense? The problem with the case was, often the saying is bad cases make bad law. You have a pretty bad guy here who had marijuana at home and also had a gun. He wasn't charged with other crimes. He could have been, but the government, I think, and you see this once in a while, in order to kind of make a case or set up an ideal test case, just charged him with having marijuana and a gun for violating the federal law that bans people who are regular users of marijuana from being able to go and have a gun. When you buy a gun, you fill out the 4473. You basically say that you're not addicted to any of these classified drugs, not using them. The problem is, for the government, since the Bruin decision made clear, though it was probably true before that, after Heller, the government, in order to make its case, has to go and show that there's a historical tradition that's similar to the type of law that they want to go and defend right now. And what types of laws were in effect in 1791 or possibly in 1868. So 1791 when the Second Amendment was adopted, or 1868 when the Bill of Rights was applied to the states by the 14th Amendment. Now, the problem is they go and look at something called surety laws or peace bonds. These are laws where if somebody was habitually an habitual drunkard, you could have to put up a bond if you're going to be able to go and keep possession of a gun. There's actually only one state, Virginia, that had this type of law and used it to restrict people's access to weapons. So it's not really clear how much of a historical tradition that is. But the government wanted to go and argue that people who use marijuana, maybe a couple times a week or whatever, were the equivalent of habitual drunkards. And you had a number of people, a number of justices like Gorsuch, was saying, look, John Adams had, a bottle of hard cider with him every morning for breakfast. You had James Madison, who had a pint of whiskey apparently every day. You had Thomas Jefferson, who said he didn't drink that much because he only had 3 or 4 glasses of wine at dinner. And so Gorsuch's question was, were any of the founding fathers, should they have been banned from having guns for protection? And, obviously his answer was no. He went through and said that at the time, it was considered common for somebody to drink maybe 8 glasses of whiskey in a day. And then in order to be classified as a habitual drunkard, you had to have at least 16 glasses of whiskey a day. Wow. They drank a lot more than we drink now on these things. I'm sure at 4 glasses of whiskey, I would be tipsy, let alone the other. But the point was that somebody would drink so much that they weren't in control of their actions. And that's the reason why they would have these types of bonds that they would force somebody to have to post. So
that's called weapons under disability, isn't it, John? That isn't that the statute? There's this legal statute that says you cannot have a weapon under a disability, which means while drunk. It doesn't mean because you drink, you shouldn't be able to have it, but you cannot wield one while you are drunk, while you're inebriated.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's lots of state laws. Yeah. You have a concealed carry permit, but you better not be carrying concealed when you're drunk, okay? And a lot of them will have, the same rules for what's considered drunk driving in terms of your blood alcohol level for carrying concealed. So, just because somebody had a drink on Sunday or got drunk on Sunday doesn't mean on Wednesday they're not able to go and carry a gun for protection.
Right.
And so that's basically the question that the Supreme Court is going to have to answer. And at least the way I heard the justices' comments, Alito and Roberts seemed by far the most sympathetic to the government's argument. Thomas was a little hard to read, but my guess is he, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett are going to say that, look, there's no real historical precedent like this, and strike down the government restriction. The interesting question is going to be with regard to the 3 liberal Democrats that are there. And the question for them is going to be, they don't want to ban people who have marijuana from having guns, but they also hate guns. So the question is, what do they hate more? Are they going to go and say that, we hate the Second Amendment so much that we don't think it should apply here, or we need a different interpretation than Bruin for it, which I'm sure Justice Jackson is going to go and argue that she's going to want to go back to some balancing test. And maybe she'll say under a balancing test where, they look at the public policy benefits and costs that people should be able to own a gun even if they have marijuana. So you may get a lot of different, split decisions on this. So it'll be interesting to see what it turns out. My own gut is that it's more than likely that the government restriction will be struck down. Exactly the reasoning for it, though, is something we'll have to see.
Yeah, and I'll lay my bias out here on the table. I don't like marijuana, and I don't like smelling it.
I don't use it.
And I don't like the 40 states that have decided to make it legal for recreation, and DC and the territories, like you correctly pointed out.
Right.
So my bias is on the table. I'm going to say this. So, but here's the one caveat that I'd like you to consider and explain to me through your lens here. You're correctly saying if I have a drink or 10 on Sunday, I can't have my gun with me on Monday. What are you talking about? Both of those things are legal. I cannot have them together if I'm going to be like we talked about. But I know and I can tell when my drunk has worn off, and so can the law if need be. But with marijuana, as you know, the THC stays in your system for up to 30 days. And so,
but it's like different levels. look,
Yeah,
I mean, they can give you.
levels, the different strengths and so forth, it can stay. So in other words, my point though being, it's just like with driving. It's one of the reasons I'm opposed to the recreational marijuana thing, largely is because of driving and the statistics. You do research on these kinds of things too, about the number of car accidents in states that have legalized recreational marijuana, because people can drive while high, and if they get arrested or busted, they can say, no, the reason I have it in my system is because I smoked 3 days ago. 5 days ago.
Right, but it's more than that. I mean, they can give them a sobriety test. They can go and have them see if they can walk in a straight line and touch their nose and do other things that are there. You know, you bring up a point. It's not as easy to go and test with that as there is. But the question is, does it impair somebody's ability to drive properly? Does it impair somebody's ability to go and function with the gun?
Right.
And maybe there needs to be more work or thought about exactly how you're going to measure it. But there's a number of people who, when they're driving recklessly, when they're high on marijuana, they get arrested and they get charged for driving under the influence that's there, and they're given sobriety tests. Now they can't have a breathalyzer, I guess.
Right.
But there are other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
And you don't always have a breathalyzer when you're dealing with somebody who's drunk. I mean, they can go and
because they refuse it, but when they do refuse it, though, they lose their license immediately.
Yeah, I agree.
Because the breathalyzer is like the
definitive.
Exactly. Because how well somebody did on the nose and everything else can
I agree.
be judgmental. So it's a real difficult thing to consider. But I just have a real problem with that aspect of it. But now here's the flip side to it, John, if I may, just before we're done here.
Sure.
We look at something like, if we choose to use marijuana as the substance where you shouldn't be able to have a gun for the reason I just described, then we look at other conditions that people might have based on something else that they've taken. There's a perfectly legal thing, like Red Bull. Somebody takes 3 or 4 of those Red Bulls, and they're overly caffeinated to the point where they're jittery. Should that person have a gun?
Sure.
Up and, you know what I mean? So we got to be very, very careful whose Second Amendment rights we infringe upon because of a substance that they take, whether it be legal or not. That's a real.
Yeah, I mean, you have, as of 2020, I think it was, there was like 3.5 million Americans that had medical exemptions for taking marijuana. Maybe they had cancer treatment and nausea that was associated with it, or Parkinson, or other types of issues that apparently. Yeah. I mean, I'm no medical expert, but apparently the claim is it helps with those things. Or somebody just needs some help sleeping, so they take a gummy once in a while. It's not obvious to me that those individuals should be prevented from being able to go and protect themselves, just because they go and do that. And the thing with the law, as it currently is, it doesn't even distinguish between those types of things. If somebody takes a gummy a couple times a week or whatever, they are banned under the current rules from being able to go and have a gun to protect themselves and their families. And that seems kind of extreme to me on that. But look, if Congress wants to revisit it, my guess is they'll have a hard time imposing new restrictions on this. But, at least that's an option. That it sounds like some of the justices, like Sotomayor and others, were interested in letting the government do it. So we'll have to see.
Well, there's a couple of words in the Second Amendment that really, really are being tested here. And exactly what does it mean to have your rights abridged? That is a legitimate question, and regardless of who you are and what you're doing. I want to throw this up here, John, before we go. Remind people, if you want to read John's amazing work, there it is. It's crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. That's the home base for the Crime Prevention Research Center. As you can see, as we scroll down here, the transgender shooter study that John just published in the Federalist is right there on his webpage. As you can see next to that, updated detailed information on mass public shootings from 98 to 2025. You can see John's social media over there on the side as well. A lot more research. There's some of the places that John's work is published in: Real Clear Politics, Federalist, and on down the line. So, and then of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you to follow John, because you can get up to date on all of the stuff and the research that he's turning up by following him on X at John R. Lott Jr. I'm John R. Lott Jr. John, you are on Facebook too, right?
Yeah, I am.
Anywhere else? Anywhere else we should talk about?
I guess Instagram, we have stuff. I don't deal with that a lot, but yeah, we have Instagram and Facebook and X are the main ones.
And you've got to cross-pollinate all of these things to really.
Yeah, I know. I need to do more of it.
No, but you do an amazing job already. You get a great following on X, and you got a great, obviously, great following in spaces like this because we want to know the truth, not just what the AP. I love this, by the way. I said earlier on, you got a war with the media. In your second paragraph of this piece on transgender shooters, you call out AP, CNN, ABC News, NBC News, MS Now, and the New York Times all at one time because none of them ever dared to mention that the Rhode Island shooter was transgender. And you wonder why the media's got a problem with you. Because you're calling them out for their horrific media malpractice and not telling the full story because it doesn't fit their agenda. So,
well, they should be embarrassed.
They should be. They absolutely should be. And, John,
well, I'm glad you're out there. At least you kind of balance it off. So,
to the extent that I can. To the extent that I can. And I know there are a lot of other guys like me doing the same thing here. And it's for good reason because work like yours deserves to be pushed, promoted, and shared. John, thanks as always for the info, and we'll catch up with you again down the line.
Sounds great. Thank you very much.
You got it. Thank you, John. That's John R. Lott Jr., Crime Prevention Research Center online at crimeresearch.org.